Okay, let's have a news roundup. We're going to have a look at the UK news and see if we can find some examples. Okay, first place you want to go is BBC Politics. Okay, nice sort of soft, easy place to start. And this is an interesting one for Unit 1 parties. So here we have Labour must respect policy dissent, says John McDonnell. Now that's interesting because policy dissent is not a very common thing in parties that win elections in the UK. When we come to the Conservative Party conference next week, I think you'll find that there's not going to be much policy dissent. There's going to be a united front with David Cameron and the cabinet at the front, and they're going to present a clear message. Whereas here we have John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, suggesting that Labour are going to have a lot of dissent at their conference. So, John McDonnell said he's pledged support for a fiscal charter proposed by George Osborne. Now, I would argue that if we're answering an exam question like to what extent has Labour stuck to its socialist principles, if you have a Labour Shadow Chancellor saying that they are going to stick to a conservative economic plan, that's evidence to suggest that Labour aren't socialist anymore. Because socialists are not so concerned with balancing the budget, they're concerned with using the government to help people. So the idea that John McDonnell is pledging a fiscal charter that George Osborne has proposed suggests that Labour have come away from their socialist roots. However, if we consider who's been elected as their leader, he is socialist. And so let's see if there's any issues that we can maybe tag socialism on. So the first thing Corbyn wants to do is actually have an inclusive process where you listen to all of the different ideas at the conference. This is interesting because conferences are becoming more and more Americanized. And back in America, back in 1996, they actually had a policy debate in the Republican conference, and it made the party look divided, and then they lost the presidential election. So having these arguments on the floor of the conference don't send out a good media image. And so it's interesting to see if they're actually going to have this proper debate that Jeremy Corbyn says they're going to have. So that's an interesting angle. So John McDonnell's angle there suggesting perhaps a move away from socialism. Obviously it's UKIP's conference at the moment. But let's have a look at this issue.
My position on Trident has been very clear all of my life. I'm opposed to nuclear weapons. I think we should fulfill our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and take steps towards disarmament. We have not done that. The party conference will be debating Trident, I've no doubt about that.
So, he's the leader. Maybe he should say that it's Labour policy that they're opposed to Trident. But as he says, he knows that that's going to be against a large wing of the Labour Party. So you can see that the Labour Party have a bit of a split in it. Corbyn, anti-nuclear weapons, aligning with the SNP. That is a much more socialist principle. Okay, because again, socialists don't think that the country should be taking a massive role in foreign affairs. They should be dealing with domestic affairs. So the replacement of Trident is obviously going to cost a lot of money. Jeremy Corbyn perhaps saying we can save that money, we can spend it on a more generous bit of spending at home, maybe. Right, let's move down. One place that I want you to go every week to is I want you to come all the way down here to the bottom. Ignore her. This is the guy. You need to look at Mark Darcy's blog. He's the parliamentary correspondent, and this is going to be very relevant to Parliament. So his article on Lib Dem threats might not add up is focused on House of Lords. So have a look here. Just pause and read this article. Straight away, by reading Mark Darcy, you've got something that we've studied in the lesson, yeah? Because this is where it's at. So basically, the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords are threatening to take down the government's plan to introduce right to buy. Now, that was in their election manifesto. But so the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords shouldn't be threatening things in the government's manifesto because that's been approved by the people. So on its face, this is a breach of the Salisbury Convention. But what Mark Darcy's saying is that even if they do it in Parliament, the government might still win anyway, because Lib Dems only have 13% of the peers, and the crossbenchers just under a quarter. So really it depends on what Labour does. As you can see here, you can spin a scenario involving a massive Tory rebellion topped up by crossbenchers and Lib Dems, which could succeed without Labour, but it's all going to come down to Labour. So the Lib Dems counting on Labour here, and as we know, depending on what position Labour takes on this, because this is an issue that the Labour Party have to be really careful with. Obviously, the idea of private ownership of housing is one of the major issues that won Margaret Thatcher 3 elections in the 1980s, and Labour's opposition to it was one of the big things that meant that they kept losing. So if Labour go back to their position that they had in the 1980s, the Labour Party needs to be very, very careful how their peers vote on this one. So as you can see here, Mark Darcy focusing on the parliamentary procedure. As we can see here, one interesting question, which is yet to be answered: is this the extent to which Labour peers will be ready to turn out in the cause of Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party? So it really matters on what the Labour Party does. Now we look at the Salisbury Convention again. Labour have said that they will operate within the conventions of the House of Lords, and that includes Salisbury Addison. And so what we're saying there is that Labour are actually going to follow the Salisbury Convention, which means that the Lib Dems, if they decide to breach the Salisbury Convention on their own, it won't make any difference. So, interesting to see there the Salisbury Convention in action on a Conservative manifesto pledge. I suggest you read that one in full. I want to go down to Mark Darcy's previous blogs because he is very good. So if we have a look at some more news, let's have a look at the week ahead in Westminster. So this is going back a little bit. This is just to give you a basic overview. In fact, let's go to the UK Parliament website to see what goes on in a day. So if we have a look at what's on, it won't be anything on today, but let's go to full calendar and let's have a look what's on next month after conference season, Tuesday. So, as you can see, we've got oral questions. Now, this is questions to ministers, health ministers' questions, and so this is a function of accountability. This is holding the government to account. Then we have a 10-minute rule motion. This is where a backbencher gets to decide something that he wants debated to bring awareness of the issue. So no fault divorce is the issue that he wants discussed. Now they will vote at the end of that. If it passes the motion, then it will get a further seeing. Now you'll notice that the vast majority of the day is going to be dominated by the immigration bill, and this is led by Theresa May, who's government minister. Now if we're saying that this is 10 minutes, it's a bit longer, but let's say that's 10 minutes, and we're saying that this is an hour. We've got an hour and 10 minutes, and then we have legislation. This is going to probably take the whole day, all the way up to 10 o'clock in the evening. And the government leads that debate, immigration bill. It's a government bill. So progression on that legislation is going to take the whole day, and then there's going to be an adjournment debate. Most people are going to go home for that, and it's going to be very low turnout. So as you can see, the timetable, the absolute lion's share of the time is being dominated by the government. And this is why backbenchers in Parliament really don't you could argue they're not effective. They don't have much time to do anything, because the government is dominating the floor with all of their legislation. Again, if we go forward, obviously Wednesday's a big day in terms of Prime Minister's questions, and that'll take half an hour. We've got questions and questions, a 10-minute rule motion, but as you can see, government legislation is taking up the vast majority of the day. And so when we say government dominates Parliament, it's not just with a majority. It's with the timetable. Look, that's just taking up all the time. When do the backbenchers really get to do anything? And arguably, the biggest job of the backbenchers is in these things, the select committees, where they hold government to account. But there's no business for these announced yet. Here we go. So the Public Accounts Committee. So That should give you an idea of what's going on in the main chamber, and Mark Darcy will mainly be talking about things like that. One last stop. Let's go to The Guardian. Interesting. That might be an interesting one to read. These are all pretty interesting because they're all quite ideologically based. I mean, here we have a Labour member saying that they'll fight any Tory revival of selective schools. Privatisation would be an idea. So this is Labour being socialist. This is very much Labour being socialist. Let's have a look. Interesting. Okay, pause and read. This is a skill I want you to develop. Because what you need to do here is you need to read this article and you need to read it critically. And the first question you have to ask is, who's writing this? The answer is Natalie Bennett. If you watched Natalie Bennett in any of the debates before the election, you'll know that Natalie Bennett is very socialist. So, as you can say, she's saying that the conservative neoliberalism is doomed to fail. Well, that's interesting because she might be right, but at the end of the day, the last election's just gone neoliberal. I think your skills of criticism need to be engaged here because you need to view this with a pinch of salt. She might be right. Be interesting to see if this does play out. My inclination is that it won't actually. Pause that and read. So I think the interesting thing here is that maybe there's too many left-wing parties. What if there was no Green Party, no SNP, no Lib Dems, no Plaid Cymru, and that all of the socialist voters in Britain voted for the Labour Party? That could be a problem for the Conservative Party. But unless that happens, the vote is so spread out. It's interesting to know whether or not this is right. So, anyway, on the news roundup, I think the most important place to go, this is obviously all Unit 1, but the most important place to go for Unit 2, because often it's hard to spot the articles, most important place to go is undoubtedly down here, straight to Mark Darcy, okay? There's one more article I just want to have a quick look at from Mark Darcy. This one. So this is following 2 no votes from Parliament, i.e. votes where Parliament has actually asserted its will over the government. Pause and read. A new word, whipping. Remember that each of the 2 parties have a team of what we call whips, who basically go around the back benches and try and make them vote in the same way as the government or the opposition wants them to vote. And it seems here that they've not tried very hard to get these votes together. So it's a reminder of the fragility of the government's majority, but it's not a reliable guide to future rebellions. The next big pinch point is likely to be a vote on military intervention in Syria, but the MPs are unlikely to define ministers on that issue, maybe a different bunch. So what we're basically saying here is, how strong is this government going to be? When there's a small majority like there is at the moment, votes like, and here's your examples or your evidence that you'd use in exam questions, murder and assisted dying. It's interesting to see that the government may be defeated more. So the government may not be as strong as we're used to seeing, even under the coalition. So Parliament's health, I think, is measured not by the amount of legislation it passes, but by the amount of good legislation it passes. The amount of times that Parliament can actually make an amendment to a bill and force the government to accept the amendment. And as we can see here, it seems to be that the government's going to have some trouble, especially on Europe, of controlling Parliament. And if that's the case, we could argue Parliament is becoming more effective in its functions.